Welcome to the deep dive. If you've ever tracked a major earthquake in the news, you know there's always that instant, almost knee-jerk focus on one number, the magnitude.
Right.
We usually call it the Richter scale, right? But if you actually look closely at the reports, you start seeing this confusing alphabet soup floating around. ML, Ms, M, and nowadays most commonly Mru.
Exactly. It gets really confusing.
Yeah, and the original Richter scale is, well, largely obsolete for big quakes, yet we all still cling to that term. So the big question for our deep dive today is, what are we really measuring when the ground shakes? Which one of these letter combinations gives us the true story, the terrifying potential of an earthquake's strength and its destructive power?
That is absolutely the essential question we need to tackle. Our mission today, really, to cut through all those acronyms because, well, seismologists use different scales for very different reasons.
Yep.
And right off the bat, we absolutely have to nail down a distinction that the public, and honestly the media too, consistently gets wrong. The difference between magnitude and intensity.
Right. I think most people probably assume those two things are basically the same, don't they? You know, a big number on the scale means big damage on the ground. Simple as that.
It seems simple, but they are fundamentally different concepts. Think of it this way. Magnitude is an estimate of the overall size of the earthquake itself at the source.
At the source, okay.
It's approximately related, let's say, to the total amount of seismic energy released deep underground where the fault ruptured.
Okay, so if the earthquake is like a bomb going off underground, the magnitude is kind of like the yield of that bomb, its total power.
That's a pretty good analogy, yes. Whereas intensity refers only to the severity or the force of the resulting ground, shaking the actual quaking at a specific location on the surface.
Okay. So intensity is what you or I, or maybe a building, actually experiences right where we are.
Precisely. It's the effect, not the cause, in a sense.
So sticking with the analogies, maybe magnitude is the engine size of a car, like its horsepower potential.
Oh.
And intensity is how fast that car is actually going right where I happen to be standing. Which, could depend on all sorts of other things I can't see from far away, like traffic, road conditions, is it going uphill?
That's a brilliant way to put it, yes. Traffic, road conditions, local geology, those are your intensity factors. And really understanding that distinction is absolutely key. It explains why two earthquakes reported with very similar magnitude, say magnitude 7.0, can cause vastly different amounts of damage. It all depends on where that shaking occurs and what the ground is like there.
Okay, that clears things up significantly right from the start. Let's unpack the foundation of this whole measurement system then. And that journey has to start, of course, with Charles F. Richter and his original scale from back in 1935, the one we formally call the local magnitude scale, or ML.
Yes, Richter. He established the two conceptual pillars, really, that all subsequent magnitude scales have built upon, even as they've evolved.
And the first pillar is the most famous one, right? The logarithmic nature of it all.
Absolutely. The scale is famously logarithmic. And that's the part, I think, that makes these magnitude numbers seem deceptively small to the average person. We hear logarithmic, but it doesn't immediately click how huge the difference is.
Okay, so break that down. What does logarithmic mean in practical terms? Like for the size of the waves that the seismographs were actually measuring.
Right. So it means that each whole number increase on the scale, say going from a magnitude 4 to a magnitude 5 or a 5 to a 6, represents a 10-fold increase in the measured amplitude of the seismic waves.
10 times higher wiggles on the seismogram paper. Got it.
Exactly. The physical shaking is 10 times bigger in terms of ground displacement recorded by the instrument.
But, and this is where it gets really mind-blowing for me, the energy jump, the actual difference in the earthquake strength, that's way more than 10 times, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. That's the second key point Richter established, or at least quantified. The destructive strength, the power of the earthquake, relates to the total energy released. And that energy is proportional to the wave amplitude raised to the power of 1.5.
Yep. Okay, math time. 10 $1.
Which works out to be approximately a 32-fold increase in the actual seismic energy released for each whole number step up the scale.
Wait, hang on. 32 times. So a magnitude 8 earthquake isn't just like a bit worse than a magnitude 7. It's fundamentally a different beast altogether, 32 times stronger.
Precisely. It's an enormous leap in energy. That jump from a 6 to a 7 is 32 times the energy. Then from a 7 to an 8 is another 32 times the energy. So an 8 is over 1,000 times more energetic than a 6.
Wow. Okay, that completely changes how I picture these numbers. That context is crucial. And Richter just picked a starting point. How did he define zero?
Well, yeah, the 0 point was defined rather arbitrarily based on a very specific instrument, a Wood-Anderson seismograph, and a tiny measurement. It was defined as an earthquake that, at a distance of 100 kilometers, would cause a maximum horizontal trace amplitude of just 0.001 millimeters, or 1 micron, on that specific seismograph.
So incredibly tiny movements for the baseline.
Very tiny. It's just a reference point. The key thing was the scale was based on measuring the waves recorded.
Which means, I guess, we need a quick primer on what those waves actually are. What energy is that instrument even registering when the ground shakes? It's not just one type of shaking, is it?
No, definitely not. When a fault ruptures, it radiates energy outward in distinct pulses, different kinds of waves.
Okay.
The first ones to arrive at a seismograph are the body waves. They're called that because they travel through the body of the Earth, through the crust and mantle.
Okay.
Within the body waves, you get the fastest ones first, the P waves. P for primary. They act kind of like sound waves, compressing and expanding the rock as they go.
Like a slinky pushing forward.
Exactly. Then, lagging behind, because they travel slower, are the S waves, S for secondary. These cause a sideways shearing or shaking motion, perpendicular to the direction the wave is traveling. These S waves are generally larger and carry more energy than P waves, so they're often more destructive.
And the time gap between the P wave arrival and the S wave arrival, that's how they figure out how far away the earthquake was, right?
That's exactly right. The SP time difference is crucial for locating the epicenter. But there's another category of waves, too.
The ones that do the most damage near the surface.
Usually, yes. Those are the surface waves. As the name implies, they travel only along the surface of the Earth, like ripples on a pond. There are two main types, love waves and Rayleigh waves.
Okay.
For earthquakes that happen relatively close to the surface, say less than about 60 kilometers deep, these surface waves tend to be the largest waves on the seismogram. They often last longer, carry the bulk of the really damaging energy, and they're responsible for most of the swaying and collapsing of buildings we see in photos and videos.
And Richter's original ML scale, it just looked at the biggest wiggle on the recording, regardless of which wave type caused it.
Essentially, yes. It was designed to measure the maximum amplitude of ground motion recorded by that specific seismograph, caused by whichever waves produced the biggest swing. It was simple and effective for its time and place.
Okay, so if Richter gave this foundational logarithmic principle back in the 1930s, and it worked for Southern California, why did seismologists immediately start feeling the need to invent, I don't know, dozens of other scales? Why did the original ML scale ultimately prove insufficient?
Well, because the ML scale turned out to be highly localized, as you said, and it had some really significant systematic limitations, especially when trying to measure very large, very powerful, or very distant earthquakes. We could probably boil it down to three major weaknesses that really pushed seismologists to develop alternatives for global earthquake monitoring.
Okay, let's lay out those weaknesses. What were the big problems?
First, distance and depth. The ML scale is fundamentally inaccurate for distant earthquakes, let's say beyond about 600 kilometers or roughly 370 miles.
Why? What breaks down over distance?
It's mainly because those important S waves, which often produce the peak amplitude locally, tend to fade out or attenuate quite strongly as they travel further through the Earth. So the scale would underestimate distant quakes. And related to that, it's also inaccurate for deep earthquakes.
Because the surface waves are smaller.
Exactly. If the earthquake source is very deep, it doesn't generate those large destructive surface waves very efficiently. Since ML relied heavily on whatever wave produced the biggest amplitude, and that was often a surface wave for shallow quakes, it just didn't work well for deep ones.
Okay, so problem one. It was really only reliable for local shallow quakes, kind of like the ones Richter was specifically studying in Southern California.
Precisely, and that leads into the second limitation, which we touched on, the geography.
Right, the rock type.
Yes, the geology. Richter calibrated ML using data from Southern California. That region is characterized by, well, relatively thinner oceanic-type crust and layers of sedimentary rock.
Okay.
But when seismologists tried to apply the same ML scale and calculations to earthquakes happening in the central and eastern parts of North America, which is geologically very different, it's an ancient, stable continental core called a craton, made mostly of thick, hard granitic rock. The ML magnitudes didn't quite match up. The numbers were anomalous.
So the same amount of energy released underground would produce a different ML reading depending on whether it traveled through California rock or, say, Missouri rock.
That's the gist of it, yes. The way seismic waves propagate, how fast they travel, how much they attenuate, it's all influenced by the type of rock and the crustal structure they pass through.
So that required specialized fixes, like new regional scales?
It did. That's where things like the MBLG scale came in. Otto Nuddley developed it in the 1970s specifically for that region east of the Rocky Mountains. It measures a specific type of short-period wave called an LG wave, which travels particularly well through that kind of stable granitic continental crust.
Okay, so we needed different tools for different geological toolboxes. ML wasn't one size fits all.
Not at all. And there were other scales developed too, like the body wave magnitude scale, MBA, that's lowercase b, which uses short-period P waves. That one turned out to be quite useful globally, especially for telling the difference between natural tectonic earthquakes and underground nuclear explosions, because they generate different ratios of body waves to surface waves.
Interesting. Okay, so distance, depth, geology. What was the third major limitation of ML? The one you said really crippled its usefulness for the biggest, most catastrophic events.
Ah, yes. That's the absolutely crucial problem of saturation.
Saturation. What does that mean in this context?
It means the ML scale systematically underestimates the size of really strong earthquakes, typically anything much larger than about magnitude 7 or maybe 7.5. It hits a ceiling, it saturates.
Why? Why does it top out? If it's logarithmic, shouldn't it just keep going up?
You'd think so, but it's because ML is based only on measuring the single peak amplitude, the highest point of the shaking recorded on that old Wood-Anderson instrument, or its equivalent.
And why is measuring only the highest peak a problem for huge earthquakes?
Because truly gigantic earthquakes, like a magnitude 8 or especially a magnitude 9 event, aren't instantaneous point sources. They involve immense fault ruptures. The fault might unzip, so to speak, over hundreds, maybe even 1,000 kilometers.
Right, like the 2004 Sumatra earthquake.
Exactly. That rupture lasted for almost 10 minutes and stretched over 1,300 kilometers. The ML scale, by just measuring the highest initial jolt somewhere near the beginning, completely misses the sheer scale and duration of the energy release from that massive extended rupture process. It doesn't account for the total work done by the fault slipping over that enormous area.
Wow, okay, so that sounds like a fundamental flaw if your measuring stick literally can't measure the biggest things you need it to measure accurately. That seems like the nail in the coffin for ML being the primary scale.
It really was, for large earthquakes at least. It became clear we needed a scale that didn't saturate and was based more directly on the physics of the fault rupture itself, not just the peak shaking at one point in time and space.
Which brings us, finally, to the modern standard. The scale that the U.S. Geological Survey, the USGS, reports most significant magnitudes with today, generally anything above magnitude 4.0. And that is the moment magnitude scale, denoted as p-value.
That's the one.
Although, confusingly, the press still often calls it Richter magnitude, doesn't it?
They do, unfortunately. It's a persistent habit. But MLW is conceptually very different from ML.
Okay, so tell us what MLW actually is. If ML measured the peak wave height, what does MLW measure?
MLW is based on a physical quantity called the seismic moment, which is denoted as M0.
Seismic moment, M0. What does that measure? Is it related to energy?
It is, but indirectly. Seismic moment, M0, is a measure of the total mechanical work done by the earthquake during the fault rupture. It's calculated based on 3 key physical parameters of the faulting process itself.
Okay, what are those?
First, the average amount of slip or displacement that occurred along the fault plane. How far did the two sides move past each other? Second, the total area of the fault surface that actually ruptured. Was it a small patch or a huge segment, hundreds of kilometers long and tens of kilometers deep? And third, the rigidity or shear modulus of the rocks involved basically how stiff they are, which relates to the friction that had to be overcome.
So slip distance times rupture area times rock stiffness. That sounds much more fundamental, much more tied to the actual physical event underground.
It absolutely is. M0, the seismic moment, is considered by seismologists to be the most objective and fundamental measure of an earthquake's total size. And the moment magnitude, MW, is essentially just a scaled version of M0 designed deliberately so that the MW numbers roughly match the older ML and M's numbers in the range where those scales were still reliable, like around magnitude 5 or 6.
So they tried to keep the numbering system somewhat consistent for familiarity, even though the underlying measurement is totally different.
Exactly. It provides continuity while being based on a much more physically meaningful quantity that doesn't saturate for even the largest earthquakes ever recorded.
Okay, so MW, based on seismic moment M0, gives us the total size, the total work done. It doesn't saturate, it's objective. objective. It seems like we finally arrived. Story over, right? We found the perfect scale.
If only seismology were that simple.
Oh.
MWU is definitely the best measure of the overall size or total energy involved in the rupture. But it still doesn't tell the whole story when it comes to predicting the damage potential.
Why not? If it measures the total size, what's missing?
This brings us to a really crucial distinction, one that the source material highlighted beautifully with that fascinating comparison of two earthquakes that happened off the coast of Chile back in 1997.
Okay, lay that example on us. This sounds like the real aha moment.
It really is, especially for understanding hazard. So in 1997, there were two significant earthquakes relatively close to each other off the coast of Chile. The first one occurred in July. It registered a moment magnitude, MWU, of 6.9.
Okay, 6.9 millibars, pretty strong.
Yes, but here's the kicker. It was barely felt on land. Very little impact. Then, just 3 months later, in October, there was another earthquake nearby. This one registered a slightly higher MWU of 7.1.
Okay, 7.1 milliwagers, so just 0.2 magnitude units higher than the first one. On the Myrdal that seems almost identical, right? Based on what we said earlier, that's not even double the energy release.
Exactly. The total seismic moment, M0, and therefore the MWU, were very similar for both events. But the effects were completely different. The second quake, the MWU 7.1 event, caused extensive damage along the coast. It injured over 300 people and destroyed or severely damaged something like 10,000 houses.
Wow. So virtually the same total size according to MWU, 6.9 versus 7.1. But one was a non-event and the other was a major disaster. How is that possible if MWU measures the total work done?
Because, and this is the critical insight, MWU measures the total energy released during the rupture, yes. But the vast majority of that total energy, often 90% or even more, isn't actually radiated away as seismic waves that shake the ground.
Where does it go then?
It gets dissipated primarily as friction along the fault plane, essentially generating heat within the Earth's crust. It's the energy consumed just overcoming the resistance to slip. The destructive force we actually feel at the surface comes only from the comparatively small fraction of the total energy that is radiated outward as seismic waves, those P waves, S waves, and surface waves we talked about.
Okay, hold on. So MWU tells us the total budget of energy the earthquake had to spend. But most of that budget gets eaten up by the friction tax, just making the slip happen. Only a small percentage actually gets sent out as the shaking waves that cause damage.
That's a perfect way to put it. MWU is the total budget. But the damage is caused by the energy that gets spent on wave propagation. And it turns out that the proportion of the total budget that gets radiated as waves can vary significantly from one earthquake to another, even for quakes with similar total budgets. Similar MWU.
Ah, so some earthquakes are just more efficient at turning their total energy into damaging shaking than others.
Precisely. And that efficiency is what the energy magnitude scale, MU, attempts to measure. It specifically quantifies that radiated seismic energy, the energy actually carried by the waves.
Okay, so let's revisit the Chilean example. MWU was 6.9 versus 7.1.
Yep.
What were the Mi values for those two quakes?
That's where the difference becomes stark. For the first quake, MWU 6.9 barely felt. The energy magnitude, mu, was calculated to be only 6.1, but for the second quake, MWU 7.1, very damaging, the mu was 7.5.
Wow, a difference of 1.4 units on the May scale. That's huge, logarithmically speaking. That's like almost 100 times more radiated energy in the second quake.
Something like that, yes.
Yeah.
The difference in radiated energy, as measured by me, was dramatically larger, and that difference correlated perfectly with the massive difference in observed damage on the surface. The Mi value told the real story about the hazard potential.
Okay, this seems incredibly important. Mi, the energy magnitude, sounds like the best measure for predicting how damaging an earthquake is likely to be. So
Yeah.
why don't we just use Mi all the time? Why is Mernor still the standard reported number?
The simple answer is that Mi is unfortunately devilishly difficult to calculate accurately and reliably, especially in real time immediately after an earthquake happens.
Why is it so hard? What's the challenge?
The complexity lies in accurately separating that relatively small fraction of radiated seismic wave energy from the enormous amount of energy that's lost as heat due to friction deep within the fault system itself. You need very good broadband seismic data and sophisticated analysis techniques to estimate that radiated energy properly, and it often takes time. MWU, based on the total seismic moment, is actually easier to calculate robustly from the standard seismic network data.
So MWU is the more readily available, stable measure of the overall size. Even if MEL might be a better indicator of the immediate shaking hazard, it's a practical calculation issue.
Largely, yes, though research is ongoing to improve Melny estimation. But it also brings us full circle back to the concept of intensity, because even if we had a perfect real-time measure of the radiated energy, the local ground conditions where you were standing are still going to massively influence how bad the shaking actually feels and how much damage occurs right there.
Right, the road conditions from our earlier analogy.
Exactly. That's where intensity scales, like the modified Mercalli intensity, MMI, scale used in the US, or the Japanese Shindo scale, become essential. They don't measure the earthquake source itself. They categorize the severity of shaking at specific locations based on observed effects, what people felt, how furniture moved, what damage occurred to buildings of different types.
And this is heavily influenced by the local geology, right? Like the soil under your feet.
Absolutely critical. The classic example always cited is the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake near San Francisco. Remember the terrible damage in the Marina District?
Oh yeah, the collapsed buildings, the fires. It looked awful there.
Well, the Marina District was actually quite far from the earthquake's epicenter, nearly 100 kilometers away, but it suffered some of the worst damage in the entire Bay Area.
Why? What happened there?
The Marina District is built on thick layers of soft soil, and worse, much of it is artificial fill, basically, loose sediment and debris dumped into the bay over decades to create land.
Ah, not solid bedrock then.
Not at all. And those soft, water-saturated sediments acted like jelly. They dramatically amplified the incoming seismic waves, increasing both the amplitude, the height of the shaking, and crucially, the duration of the strong shaking. The ground there shook much more violently and for much longer than nearby areas built on solid rock, even though they received roughly the same initial energy from the distant quake.
So the local site conditions essentially took the incoming waves and magnified their destructive power. That's intensity in action.
Precisely. That's why intensity maps, which show the pattern of shaking severity across a region, are so vital for understanding damage patterns and for emergency response. The magnitude number alone doesn't tell you where the worst shaking actually occurred.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize this whole journey through the magnitude alphabet soup. It feels like we've gone from a simple but flawed starting point to a much more nuanced picture.
I think that's right.
We started with Richter's ML, the local magnitude. Groundbreaking for its time, logarithmic, but ultimately limited by distance, depth, geology, and crucially, it's saturated. It couldn't measure the biggest quakes accurately because it only looked at peak amplitude.
Yep.
Then the need for a more universal, physically based measure led us to the MinW, the moment magnitude. This one is based on the seismic moment, M0, which reflects the total mechanical work done, the slip area, the displacement, the rock rigidity. It's the objective measure of the earthquake's total size and doesn't saturate.
Yes, the standard measure of size now.
But as the Chilean example showed us, the total size, MinW, doesn't always directly correlate with the damage potential. For that, we need to understand how much of the total energy actually got radiated as seismic waves, which is what the energy magnitude, tries to capture.
The radiated energy fraction. Yeah.
And finally, even knowing the radiated energy isn't enough because the actual shaking severity at any given spot, the intensity, is hugely dependent on local factors like soil type, which can amplify or de-amplify the waves.
That's the complete picture. From source size, MMW, to radiated energy, to local effect intensity. They're all different pieces of the puzzle.
So the single Richter number the public hears is really just the beginning of a very complex story about hazard.
It is. And that brings up perhaps a provocative thought to leave our listeners with, something related to me and intensity that seismologists and emergency planners grapple with.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, given that we know MW measures the total size, but me reflects the radiated energy that causes damage. And given that the proportion of energy radiated, the Mendel ratio essentially, can vary quite a bit, depending on things like the type of faulting and the depth of the quake, it raises an interesting question about how we should respond immediately after a large earthquake.
Okay.
Should emergency planning and those initial public alerts rely more heavily on real-time measurements of the actual ground shaking itself, rather than waiting for the calculation of the overall Mebly review number, which might take a bit longer to refine and doesn't directly tell you about the shaking severity everywhere?
You mean focusing immediately on things like peak ground velocity or acceleration?
Exactly. Measurements like peak ground velocity, PGV, or peak ground acceleration, PGA, which come directly from strong ocean sensors on the ground, are very highly correlated with the forces that actually damage buildings. They reflect the intensity and are closely linked to that radiated energy me.
So prioritize the effect measurements over the source size measurement in the immediate aftermath.
Perhaps for initial response, yes. Japan, for instance, has an incredibly dense network of these strong motion instruments. Within minutes of an earthquake, they can generate maps showing the distribution of measured PGA across the affected area. This gives them an almost instant picture of where the strongest, most damaging shaking likely occurred, allowing them to direct emergency services much more effectively, often before the final megamu is even settled upon.
That makes a lot of sense. Using real-time ground truth to guide the immediate response rather than waiting for the full analysis of the source rupture. It's about getting actionable information out fast.
It's a different philosophy focusing on impact rather than just size. So, while Merrick W is the fundamental measure of how big the earthquake was, maybe PGV or PGA maps are the future for truly rapid hazard assessment and public warning. Something to think about next time you hear that initial magnitude report.
Absolutely. It really drives home that the number we hear on the news, that seemingly absolute measure of an earthquake, is actually just the starting point for this incredibly complex calculation involving friction deep underground, the type of rock the waves travel through, and even the dirt beneath our feet. We've definitely decoded some of that alphabet soup today.
Hopefully demystified it a bit.
Definitely. And if you are listening, I really do encourage you to look up some animations or videos comparing how P waves and S waves move through the ground. Seeing that difference in motion really puts those first few rattling seconds of an earthquake into a clearer, maybe even slightly less frightening perspective. It's fascinating stuff.